Vince, do you have? All right, so we're calling to order the October 5th meeting of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. This open meeting of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is being conducted remotely pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021. Members of the public wishing to participate in the meeting must use their full names for Zoom access. If full names are not used, people will not be allowed to participate in the discussion. The town reserves the right to remove any member of the public from the meeting who doesn't use a full name or who acts inappropriately. I am Mary Longacre, Chair of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. As a preliminary matter, permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Gary Beller.
Present.
Sarah Boyce.
Here.
Peter Brace.
Here.
Don't see Matt Fee. Oh, no, I do see Matt Fee. Good
I am here.
Yeah. Is Ian Golding.
I'm here.
Jen Carberg.
Here.
Fritz McClure.
Here.
And do we have Joanna Roach joining us? Perhaps not yet. Okay. Staff, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Vince Murphy.
Here.
Vince, do we have anyone else that you see on staff? I don't
No.
see anyone. Okay. And anticipated speakers on the agenda, please respond in the affirmative. Trevor Johnson, representing the Arcadis project team.
Here.
And Trevor, I think you're the only one that is expecting to speak today from your team, but you might have some other members for observance. Is that
Correct.
Okay, great. So ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will feature public comment. For this meeting, the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is convening by a video conference via the Zoom app as posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. Please note this meeting is being recorded and all attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other people may be able to see you and take care not to share your device's screen. Anything you broadcast may be captured by the recording. Please silence all phones and devices when you're not speaking. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless the chair notes otherwise. All supporting materials that have been provided members of this body are available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. Before we turn to the first item on the agenda, permit me to cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct of our business and to ensure accurate meeting minutes. The chair will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude the remarks, the chair will go down the list of members, inviting each by name to provide any comments, questions, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Further, please remember to mute your phone or computer when you're not speaking, and please remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. For any responses, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you and state your name before speaking. If members wish to engage in a conversation with other members, please do so through the chair, taking care to identify yourself. After members have spoken, the chair will afford public comment to those members of the public that have joined the meeting via Zoom. Members of the public who wish to speak must state their names and be acknowledged by and speak through the chair. If you're not able to participate in the remote meeting, you may also submit comments to the Coastal Resilience Coordinator, Vince Murphy, to be read into the meeting record, and his email address is vmurphy@nantucket-ma.gov. Finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by a roll call vote. And just a reminder for public comment in this forum, please use the raise hand feature to let us know that you would like to make a comment. If you're not being recognized, you can use the chat to send a message to me or to Vince to let us know that you have a comment that you would like to make, but we are not equipped to take comments through the chat. Anything else before we get started? Vince, good to go?
I'm good.
Okay, so the purpose, well, let me start with the agenda. So this is a continued discussion from our September 28th meeting with the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee and the representative from the Coastal Resilience Plan Project Team, Trevor Johnson. We are reviewing the two documents that were provided by the project team. That is the draft of the Coastal Resilience Plan and the accompanying revised existing conditions and risk assessment report. Those are available on the town's website for download, and hopefully people were able to review them in the week since the last meeting when they were presented to us. We'll start with the members. Vince, can you go ahead and take that agenda down? Thank you. So are there further comments from members or questions that you have for Trevor regarding the two reports that were delivered a week and a half ago? And I'll also mention that there is an email address provided for direct feedback to the project team. That was nantucket.crp@arcadis.com. The comment period was requested by yesterday to submit all the comments. Hopefully people have been able to do that. Peter?
Yeah, first, an admission that last week and the weekend were committed to the burial of my mother, which was delayed by 2 years because of COVID. So that's where my head was, and it wasn't into reading the report. Although I did, I'm sorry, it wasn't committed to reviewing the draft plan, but from last week and just skimming it, there's no mention of the any contingency for the shellfish hatchery on Brant Point. And I'm just wondering, and I am going to read the draft and comment when I can, but I'm just wondering, is that because the shellfish hatchery is already on pilings and there are ramps going up to it, but being right at the tip of Brant Point, I would think that that's a place that's going to be underwater quickly. So I'm just wondering about that.
Thank you, Peter. Trevor, do you have any comment on the shellfish hatchery, or Vince, did you want to comment on that first? Go ahead.
Up to Trevor if he wants to go first.
Vince, go ahead. I can also respond. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a bit of a tricky one, Pete. You might know part of the story. The town owns the hatchery building, but the property it's on isn't belong to the town. It's belonged to
Coast Guard.
That's right, the Coast Guard. So that presents some issues. That's kind of one of the main problems. And while it's high enough at the moment that it's out of a flood zone, the first floor elevation of the building, that's not the case for the dock out back. And that's a problem we're trying to understand. The other one is if there was to be another access point in the event of a serious or prolonged flooding event, we'd have to get permission from the Coast Guard and a federal agency. That's a bit of an unusual holdup.
Okay. Just want to bring that to light.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is just that, access to the hatchery along Easton Street is also a consideration. So part of the strategy for Brant Point is looking at an elevation strategy for Easton Street that would serve as or prolong access to the hatchery in its current location. Obviously a water dependent use, so it needs to be on the water somewhere, and that location that it's presently at seems to be working for now. I think again, this is the sort of monitor ongoing risk, monitor changes in risk, and develop an adaptation strategy for that particular facility type over time.
Thank you, Trevor. Peter, go ahead and follow up.
I just want to be an advocate early on for giving us more time to comment on the plan. That's all. And if it's just me, then I understand. But yeah.
I don't think it's just you, and I'm sure that topic will come up again.
Okay.
So other comments or questions from committee members at this point? All right, are there members? Oh, Sarah, go ahead. And if there are members of the public, go ahead and use that raise hand feature so that I know that you have a comment or question. And then we'll go to Gary after Sarah.
Thank you, Mary. And this is a kind of a broad question for the group for discussion, I guess, since there wasn't a lot of other discussion immediately. Where some of the, in a lot of the different areas, there's talks of ecological restoration, and it's kind of a vague term. And so I appreciate that in those areas, there's, either there's more specifics that need to be known about an area. But the other question, the kind of more specific question I have is sort of twofold. It's some of the areas are, obviously where there needs to be restoration to the salt marsh or added value or, assist with salt marsh migration or something like that. But there's kind of like a broad area, and the ownership of that area is quite broad. So it crosses public, town, conservation land, and things. So I'm just wondering if there's thought to, the next step for that. So like a lot of what we've been talked about last time, we're like, how do we go to those next steps? So I know the first step is that it's a general like ecological restoration. And so that's a very general term, and we have to think about that specific area and what the needs are. But are there recommendations moving forward for even how to kind of bring all this together? Because I think we know that the next steps are going to be time consuming anyway because of the need to get grant funding and all this stuff. But for unifying like individual homeowners along Long Pond, plus the conservation land, plus the town and the DEP for the dump, and like all the different entities. I just would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Sarah. Trevor, do you have a response?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point and interesting question. I might need to think on it for a little bit, but I think there's kind of two, I think, tracks, right? First is the engagement, right, in terms of building the kind of coalition of property owners that are needed to pursue ecological restoration goals when you have resource areas that span property owners, right? The sort of habitat and ecological zones don't respect individual properties. So that's one track, and then the other is I think more detailed study of the actual ecological needs and kind of issues, similar to the work that was done around the culverts on Matticat Road by a team a few years back. I'm forgetting the exact year, but did establish some much more detailed strategies and needs for those areas. And I think that's leading to some ditch remediation and work in Matticat Ditch in the near term. I could be wrong about that, but so, kind of pursuing additional science-based detailed study in particular resource areas like Folgers Marsh, like Long Pond. So I think it's kind of two tracks, and they don't necessarily need to be done in isolation, right? There's probably a kind of coordination that needs to happen across those two pieces to pursue those ecological restoration goals. I think the reason we are more general in the CRP is that there is just a lot of unknowns, and we want to preserve the opportunities for the experts on Nantucket, Nantucket Conservation Foundation and many other conservation and ecologically focused organizations to pursue what actually makes sense for those properties over time.
Thank you, Trevor. Gary, you had a question or comment?
Yes, a couple of them. The first is, last when we used to talk about the plan, we said it's going to come out at the end of September. Today, we're talking about the fact that people may feel they need more time to kind of review the materials. So I'm just curious, what are we thinking about when we actually, at some point, we have to produce the plan? I don't know if at some point our relationship with Arcadis changes or whatever, but so my first question is, what is the timetable for actually finalizing getting the plan out? That's the first question. The second question is, as you recall at the last session, when we were asked about what suggestions or recommendations we have, I made the suggestion, and others made suggestions, not exactly the same, but along similar vein, that part of what they should be doing when the study is finally finished is that those 40 projects ought to be prioritized so that at least we have 5 top matters, so that if select board is trying to figure out, where do we tackle this thing, at least Arcadis will have given us the recommendation that these are the 5 most important things that you need to concentrate on now. So some of us made those kinds of suggestions at the last meeting. To the extent that Arcadis is going to, in fact, follow up on that, when are we going to see that draft? Those are my 2 comments.
So we, as I mentioned, we're probably going to discuss the timeline. I'd like to give people the opportunity to speak so that we have a better sense of what the issues are. So if we can maybe punt on that question until later in the meeting, Gary, would that be acceptable?
Sure.
And was there another part that you wanted a more specific
Well,
answer to now?
In other words, if we say that maybe we won't be able to get the final plan out until, say, October 30, or whenever, that'll give Arcadis a chance to send a revised draft, or at least a draft with a couple of changes based on the conversations they've been having with us and the public over the last few weeks. So that'll be fine.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to that topic.
Okay.
So we do have several members of the public who've raised their hand, but I'm going to recognize Ian Golding first as a member of the committee. Ian, can you go ahead with your comment or question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of questions. I'm curious how you develop the transfer of development rights so that the system isn't gamed, and whether that's an issue. And then in terms, we brought up last month or a couple of months ago, just how much sand is going to be involved in trying to augment the beaches around the island. And there's no mention of an estimate of the volumes, which I would have thought would be very useful for the town to start contemplating how they're going to go about getting those amounts of sand. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Trevor, do you have any thoughts on that?
On the first question, I am unclear what you mean by gamed. Maybe Ian, you could elaborate on that so I can.
Well, it occurred to me that it would be, people who would deliberately buy property in a high risk area in order to make a financial gain by arranging for a transfer of development rights. And I was wondering whether in your experience that actually happens, or so that was maybe an aside, but
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that potential outcome. I mean, you could, if somebody purchases property and doesn't develop it, and transfers the development rights, you could see that as a positive, as a part of the goal of the TDR transfer of development rights program. So the point of that type of program is to provide a financial incentive for conservation of lands that are targeted for conservation or at high risk. So I think that the details of a TDR program need to be ironed out in a very detailed, with attorneys and other folks, opining on that. So I think there are probably ways to mitigate for the potential for that, gaming of the system, as you say. And then the volume of sand, I think, there's a couple responses to that. I think at this stage of, in order to do cost estimation, we have to develop some sense of the volume of sand that might be needed. At this stage of design, these are very preliminary estimates. So it is not the, detailed level of we know exactly how much sand is needed, but we can certainly provide some kind of high level estimate. It is going to be a lot of sand, as you note, right? And that's just the sort of targeted projects that we're speaking about in our focus areas. And the work that we're recommend to develop kind of a sand budget and more understanding of the sediment transport systems will help inform and prioritize those projects based on the availability of sand. So we can certainly provide the estimate, but at the planning stage, these are high level estimates, right? That would be refined through a more design led process.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, and I understand the limitations, and thank you.
Thank you, Ian and Trevor. So I do want to go to two members of the public that have had their hands up for a little while now, and then we will return to the committee members, unless one of the committee members wants to speak directly on the question that was just raised. Give me a wave if that's the case. Jen? Okay, well, it looks like all of you. So we'll continue with the committee members. My apologies to the members of the public, and thank you for waiting. Jen, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mary. My response is not to this question, but to the one that Sarah had raised. So I had a response for a while now. It was a really good question, thinking about this plan is set up and facilitated in a way that we can act on town land and town can act on town land. What do we do about all those other pieces, the private pieces or the ecological, restoration where it's not necessarily within the town's hands to act? And I guess, and this is just putting out something for thought or future conversation, but it seems like possibly a role for the CRAC committee on one side, once we've figured out prioritization of projects and areas to focus on, where we as the CRAC could potentially pull in representatives from homeowners associations to talk about some of the recommendations we have for those areas, and at least facilitate the conversation so that private property owners could take action. Similar to the conservation groups, the Conservation Foundation owns a significant area of the salt marshes that will need to be, restored, migrated, facilitated, et cetera. And that's something we're looking at, but it's also something where if we decide we need to take that action, we could come to the CRAC to ask for help with, things have been prioritized in the plan. Now we can go to Vince to work with the town, or come to the CRAC to say, okay, we know we need to do stuff here. How can what's the best way to work within the plan to do this restoration work? So I guess I just wanted to say, I see that as possibly a future role for the committee to work on how we get stuff implemented on private properties. And so that's maybe just a future point for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Let's go to Matt.
And just regarding the TDRs, on those, we talked about those during the comp plan for, not for coastal resiliency, but for how to direct development into the right areas. And they weren't really supported by the town and the public. They were too complicated for most people to understand. And for sort of the reason that Ian said, well, someone's going to get something. How come I can't get something? There was that whole part of it. So, the devil is in the details. The receiving areas have to be thought through properly. And, it takes a lot of work, and it's not just attorneys. It's great to think, hey, we can hand it to the attorneys, but the attorneys need the input to, need the input to make to make it work, need the input from the public to make it work. So so the structure, the devil's in the details. The structure of it would take staff, lawyers, coastal resiliency, or some other work group, months, if not a year, to organize. And so it's pretty complicated. It's similar to, I think, I keep asking, how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to better this or not better it? And that is another one that I think we've kind of ducked, so how are we going to share the cost of this? How are the people who benefit? How are we going to set up betterment districts? And those details are going to really matter, so that these things are support, so the necessary changes actually happen and happen in a timely manner. And I think that has, similar to TDR, it's one thing to say, oh, you can use TDR, you can use betterments, you can use this. The devil's going to be in the details.
Thank you, Matt. Joanna Roach also had a comment or question.
Yes, hi. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the sand. So thank you, Ian, for bringing that up, because when I was thinking about this plan over the weekend, I was really trying to understand the scope of the sand, and also just wanted to understand the price of one truck of sand and how much sand you thought could be used or utilized from different projects on Nantucket. So maybe a little bit more explanation around how you see the sand coming to the island, how much of just even a truckload costs, and the pattern of how that would work. Are we talking about 10 trucks, 12 trucks, 20 trucks? Is this coming in a day? Is it coming over a week? I want to understand more about the sand. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Vince, you have a response to that, and then we will get to members of the public.
Yeah. So I also want to afford Trevor a chance to respond to part of your question. Sand is a major issue. One of the things that's in the study as a recommendation is the sediment transport study and sediment budgeting. So we need to do both of those to understand the real answer to your question, and to Matt's question, and to Ian's question about sand. That's kind of a requirement. Cost of a truck of sand, it depends. Sorry to give you the how long is a piece of string answer. For the most part, so let's imagine first sand coming locally before we imagine it coming from off-island sources. If it comes locally, it might come from, say, a dredging project within Nantucket Harbour or Madaket Harbour. So that dredging would be done for navigation purposes, but the side benefit would be the sand you get from it. That would probably be a $0 cost because it would be a town resource. It would only be the cost of transporting it. If we're buying from, say, a pit on island, there's a couple of issues with understanding the cost of that. The going rate for a cubic yard of sand at the moment is in and around $100 for the sake of argument. I think it's 97 for graded sand at the moment, 92 for ungraded. That's something I haven't checked in about 2 weeks, but that's a ballpark for where we are roughly at the moment. But then once you get into, that's like if you just turn up at a yard and just want to buy a cubic yard of sand. Whereas if you start bulk buying and then bulk ordering and delivery, you go from 90 down to 70, and if it's huge quantities, down to 50 or under, and that may or may not include delivery as well. Then that's kind of the local sources and trying to understand the pricing and bulk pricing, which is something that I have to say I'm still trying to wrap my head around, and how the town would work with that. It seems easier for a company, whereas the town may have to pay prevailing market rates, and that's something I still don't understand. Happily admit that one. Then it doesn't really get trucked on island. If it gets brought on island, like any other aggregate or any other sediment or big rock or whatever, it's usually barged in, and then that's done by the larger companies that deal with such things, and that's done in such high quantities. It brings the cost down, but I don't know that would we ever get to that point. Hopefully not. I don't know.
So you're right, Vince, it depends.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to go to, I'm sorry, Trevor, did you have anything you wanted to add at this point?
No, I mean, just on that last point, I think Vince has raised before, and this is in the plan, we can't forget about the need for potential storage locations for sand, after it is dredged or acquired in one way or another. Often you need to settle it, you need to test it before it's used in projects. And so there is a spatial requirement for storing sand as well.
Thank you, Trevor. Right, RJ Turcott has had his hand up the longest. RJ, would you go ahead, and we will come back to committee members after we take a couple comments from the public.
Thank you, Chair Longacre. RJ Turcott on behalf of the Nantucket Land Council. Forgive me if I missed this during earlier conversations, but has the Civic League sent this plan out to the homeowners associations, and have you heard back at all from any of them yet? Thank you.
So the Civic League is a private body not affiliated with this committee, so we couldn't answer that question. I can tell you that the town has undertaken to advertise the fact that the plan is available for comment, and to advertise this meeting in particular as an opportunity for comment. We have no way of knowing how many people were reached by those efforts. So sorry, RJ, we can't offer you an answer on that one. I'll go to Charles Stott. Charles, are you able to unmute?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just on the last question, the Civic League did send out information provided by Vince Murphy to our member associations, and some of them may have shared that with their members. I just had a couple of points that I wanted to make. One, the draft report refers to the potential of converting Millie's Bridge to pedestrian-only use. Now, whether or not there are houses that will still be occupied in Smith Point, there will still be pedestrians crossing the bridge for recreational purposes. And it just seems to me that there has to be some means for emergency vehicles to access Smith Point. The second question is, was there any consideration given to using groins as New Shore did successfully in a number of places in southern states, or using the Joe Farrell proposal to sink beach modules offshore to rebuild the beach or create artificial reefs?
Trevor, can you respond to that?
Yes. So I mean, we are aware of the, well, firstly, I think we looked at the largest or at the widest spectrum of potential tools across the island, including more structural or hardened structures like groins in locations like Mattakit and elsewhere. In terms of mapping those against the evaluation criteria of the project and many of the other objectives of the town, and also feasibility from a permitting perspective, solutions like that were sort of deprioritized due to the potential lack of support from the community, but also potential for significant permitting challenges that could be characterized as kind of fatal flaws. I think that, yeah, we're aware of some of the proposals that have been discussed in Mattakit for offshore structures. And, we've talked at length with Vince about those as well. But yeah, the strategy for Mattakit is trying to accomplish an erosion mitigation strategy that is more nature-based in character than utilizing hardened structures.
All right, thank you. We'll go to Matt Fee.
Yeah, just commenting on the sand is when we had the work group for the Concom and SBPF and the select board, that was a huge topic of discussion, was the amount of sand they've learned. As they have learned, it's expensive and difficult, and it's something that we as a committee and we as a town have should learn from their experience. One of the thoughts that came out of that, and it needs more work because some of it's not legal with the state now, but probably will be, was if they're going forward, is they would have to find a borrow site. They would have to move it by slurry to a storage site. And as we're doing a plan, we should be thinking of storage sites close to where we need it. So we have, like a storage site might be at the Loran station, to be able to move it again by slurry back down to SBPF, to use them as an example. We might have to find a storage site near the sewer beds for the sewer. And so, and then move it by slurry. We're not talking a couple truckloads when we're looking at the numbers we're gonna need. We're talking thousands of trucks, and it's not feasible. So, what we have to be thinking about, and Vince is 100% right, it's easier for a private entity to work their way through and get some of this done and accomplished than it would be for us as a municipality with, sort of the constraints that we have as a town with staffing and resources. And so there's a lot of issues that go into this. So I think, one of the best recommendations that came out of that work group to the Concom and to the town was to have that, have that be pursued by SBPF, by a private party, to solve, to help solve it for them, but solve it for the town. So that was so those are just some thoughts on sand. I think we all recognize, and especially people who are using sand now, recognize it is going to be the way things are done now are going to change, and are going to have to change. How they'll change, who knows? But they're going to have to, not just on Nantucket.
Thank you, Matt. We'll go to Ian Golding.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to sort of build on what Matt and also Joanna were saying about the sand, to use the geotube extension as an example, that's roughly half a mile or 2,600 feet. And a preliminary calculation is that it would use 123,000 cubic yards of sand, which is about $12 million worth of sand at $100 a cubic yard. And to help visualize that, I use the blimp concept of 17 blimps worth of sand. And when you think of that, what's necessary around the island from what we're talking about, to build on what Matt is saying, I mean, I think it's clear that we're going to need federal permits to have offshore mining, and the sooner we start down that road to facilitate it, the better, I would imagine. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ian. And I'll note, my perspective is that when you start putting sand on a beach as a protective measure, you need to keep doing it in perpetuity. It's a forever commitment. And that makes it a lot more difficult.
Very true.
So Bruce Mandel, just for clarity, sent an email and requested it be forwarded to committee members. The email was sent late last night. It was forwarded early this morning. So Bruce, you do have the opportunity to summarize that rather than reading that verbatim. And we will attach that to the minutes since you requested to have it included.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I have several comments, of course, compliments on the draft report. It's certainly a good discussion starter. Of course, Trevor, I'm mainly concerned with the West End. That's where we live. Mattocket and parts of the North Shore. The email I sent last night addresses the what I think is kind of an overlap where the western end of what the report lists as North Shore should rightly be included in Mattocket for geographical reasons, for ground flow, water protection. It's part of the Mattocket Harbor needs area. And I'd like you to take a review of those documents that I shared and listed in terms of perhaps altering the designation there. And in that regard, the report for the West End does not discuss the Massasaura Bridge. And I think that's an important infrastructure piece here. There is a tech engineering report and recommendations that goes along with their in-progress redesign of the repairs and maintenance needed at both Massasaura Bridge and the Ames Street Bridge. And their recommendations are a little bit at odds with what the draft report is discussing. And I think there ought to be a way to bring those two recommendations into alignment. Tech engineering recommends the elevation and the preservation of the Ames Street Bridge for obvious reasons in terms of providing services and things like that to the residents and the ongoing discovery of PFAS in our groundwater and the need to extend town water even to Smith's Point needs to be a consideration, I believe. And you mentioned, Trevor, the Mattocket Ditch as one of the items of interest, but you don't mention the North Cambridge Street temporary culvert that goes over that ditch. I believe the report should treat that temporary culvert in the same manner it treats the two temporary culverts on Mattocket Road. Let's see, we talked about, I got a little list here, sorry. So I don't think we should be thinking about abandoning the intersection of Mattocket Road and Ames Street. That's basically instructions the town gave tech engineering and therefore very little work to be done on Massasaura Bridge. So if we're going to either convert Ames Street Bridge to pedestrian only, why are we considering rebuilding it now as vehicular and pedestrian? And the same thing goes for the Massasaura Bridge. Are we going to elevate it? Or are we going to just do what tech engineering was instructed to do that's in kind of opposition to their recommendations to elevate it? If we're not going to elevate the Massasaura Bridge, how are we going to maintain access to Mattocket when we have difficulties on Mattocket Road at the two temporary culverts in the landfill area? That's the only access to Mattocket. And I think the report needs to take a look at the Massasaura Bridge, please.
Thank you, Bruce. Trevor, did you have any response to that?
I think Vince was raising his hand. I did want to clarify because it was brought up earlier too. The recommendation for Ames Avenue Bridge to convert to pedestrian only is a long-term recommendation that is not something that is part of the near-term strategy. The near-term strategy is to maintain the bridge as long as it's needed. Emergency access to Smith's Point is needed. It is a critical access infrastructure for Smith's Point and is necessary to be maintained. So just wanted to clarify that we're not recommending conversion to a pedestrian only access as a near-term strategy there. Vince, were you gonna weigh in?
Yeah, very, very briefly. Just want to catch two things. The TEC engineering that's been undertaken by DPW for Massasaura Bridge is far more advanced than what's in the CRP, and that is partly what we're drawing on, and just leave that as a existing DPW project, so to speak. The other one is the North Cambridge Street culvert. While there's a business and houses on the other side of it, they are far fewer properties served by that culvert, and also there's an alternative egress point. I think it's called, is it North Heron Way or White Heron Way? So there's an alternative exit point to the north on the opposite side of that.
Thank you, Vince. I'll mention one of the difficulties that I had was that there didn't seem to be a connection between work that is already ongoing for coastal resilience or work that needs to be done right now, for instance, the Sheep Pond Road area, and the projections or the recommendations in the coastal resilience plan. So it wasn't clear if the coastal resilience plan simply assumed that we were going to do the things that we already need to do, or if it was not recommending specifically that we do those things, or if it was recommending them but as part of larger projects. So I had difficulty trying to connect what was in the plan with what's on the ground right now. So I'll just mention that. Vince, you have a response for that? Or
yeah, this might partly be on me. So the, say, Sheep Pond Road, for the sake of argument, that's something that's being worked through at the moment. There's no clear determination finished yet. That's something that's being worked through with NCF and town admin. I'm only somewhat peripherally involved, and I'm trying to make sure that we can build resilience into it, because I'm not getting answers to be able to provide to the CRP because they aren't there yet. That might be on me for having tried to fudge that one a small bit and not get an accurate enough information to the project team.
okay, thank you, Vince. Sarah has a hand up. Sarah Boyce.
Thank you. This is partly to respond to the map that was sent around from Bruce earlier, but I just want to say something to what Vince said first, was that maybe the plan can have some sort of either blanket statement or something at the end, that references some things that are happening. Like, you don't need all the details for all the aspects of Sheep Pond, especially if something's in progress, but just mentioning that there are other, and it might say this because I've been reading through, but I haven't read every single bit of text. And I know that there's some from the draft too that still need to be put in place, but maybe just a blanket that there are projects going on and they should be in concert with the other findings and recommendations for the CRP. But what I was going to say, and I wrote this to Vince earlier, and Trevor, please correct me if I'm misrepresenting, but I think while the watershed map is very valuable in understanding the watershed of Mattakit in particular, I think that the discussion of the sort of neighborhoods or areas, whether it's the North Shore or Mattakit or town, is more for discussion. It's not referencing any particular area for watershed management or what is happening. So each area wasn't analyzed as its own area. So the analysis of the erosion and sea level rise and storm surge and everything is at the island-wide scale, as well as the saltwater intrusion and everything. So the locations are just for discussion. So any information that the watershed maps and additional, hydrology information we have from any different area will inform that area, all aspects of that area. Is that correct to say, Trevor? It's not, the neighborhoods are mainly for discussion points.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we're trying to just, for the sake of clarifying the strategic focus areas, we've used certain areas, but it isn't meant to say that there's necessarily a hydrologic or ecosystem based or these are not regions that are defined in those terms. They're simply defined as kind of areas for discussion within the context of the plan itself.
Thank you, Trevor. And I'll note that in the contract for the coastal resilience plan, we specifically gave the consultants the charge to figure out how to group the island into different parts. I think the assumption there was it would be based on the resilience needs and not on geopolitical divisions. Other comments or questions? Bruce, do you have your hand up again or still? Again, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just two quick comments. I appreciate the fact that the neighborhood or the locations in the report are for discussion purposes. And that's exactly what we're doing now, having a discussion about this and why I feel it's important that the comments that I raised about it should be considered. Vince, I'm a little confused about your comments. Is the ongoing design work for Main Street Bridge and Massasaura Bridge, is that not to be shared with Trevor and his group for possible coordination and discussion purposes, number one? And from your comments, maybe I'm taking this wrong, but correct me, is the culvert on North Cambridge, which you think there's an alternate access to, I would challenge some of those heavy vehicles with large amounts of gas and things like that going down that way. But your point is well taken. But is the North Cambridge culvert and the Massasaura Bridge, which is not included in the report, are those to be specifically omitted from the CRP report?
Vince or Trevor?
So for the Massasaura Bridge one, that's something that since the departure of the former DPW director, I'm trying to understand who's leading that project now. So I'll be able to get you clear answers once I have that. Then for the Massasaura Bridge, sorry, not Massasaura, for the culvert at North Cambridge, I'm trying to understand. So yeah, vehicles could get emergency access. I never said large vehicles, and beg your pardon. The area will still be usable for quite some considerable length of time, and I would think it would be, because of the extreme low-lying nature of the area, some kind of phased withdrawal. Probably, well, I don't even know if I want to put a time scale on it, over many decades, certainly. That bridge, that culvert at Cambridge Street, North Cambridge Street, will still be viable for many more years, probably a couple of decades. So I'm kind of struggling to see where's the need to assess it. I might be off base there.
I wasn't suggesting that it get
Well, let's have Trevor respond. Bruce, let's have Trevor respond before so we can get all the information you need to respond. Trevor, was there anything you wanted to add about the inclusion?
I was going to say that it's not specific. I would say it's not specifically to be excluded from the coastal resilience plan. The reason that we focus on the Matticat first and second bridge on Matticat Road is because that is a critical access route to Matticat. As you know, it is the main thoroughfare that leads to town and is a critical from a kind of evacuation and community safety standpoint. It doesn't mean that no action should ever be taken at the North Cambridge Street culvert. I think actually the Matticat culvert study that was done a few years ago that I referenced earlier does have some recommendations for long-term actions there. We're trying to prioritize actions within the CRP that get the kind of greatest benefit for the town in terms of resilience. And that's simply why we focused on the Matticat Road culverts. It doesn't mean that North Cambridge Street doesn't need attention as part of an ecological restoration goals and other strategies, but in terms of life safety and emergency access, a little bit less high priority. And as Vince says, these are low-lying areas. Many of these areas are, as part of the plan, targeted for reductions in density over time due to the nature of that risk. And the North Cambridge Street culvert does have, it has service life maintaining, service life will continue over the next couple decades. So it's not at risk of frequent inundation in the very near term.
Thank you, Trevor. Bruce?
So Vince and Trevor, thank you for those comments. I would still like to see this draft report in the area that discusses Matticat, the project prioritization, the implementation roadmap. I'd still like to see the Massasaura Bridge included in the plan, at least mentioned in it. The Massasaura Bridge is a pretty vital bridge to the west end. And I would also like to see a little more commentary in terms of perhaps your graphics on the Ames Street Bridge. The graphics seem to point only to dune restoration or relocation of maintenance and monitoring of the bridge, whereas there's a current project to improve the bridge, or at least to reconstruct part of it and to provide a little better access. So I'm just asking that the report please consider those elements and perhaps see fit to mention them, even in passing. But the fact is, it needs to be part of the overall study, I believe. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I don't see any other hands at the moment, but please do feel free to raise your hand, or otherwise let me know that you have a comment. I'm going to add my perspective and to build on what I said previously. I'd like to see more explanation of how the Coastal Resilience Plan has an overall scope, both in terms of short-term versus long-term, and in terms of individual areas versus island-wide, looking at how do we accomplish 40 projects in less than 15 years with the resources that we have available, and is that too ambitious? What happens next after those 40 projects? How do we continue to plan, and how do we relate all of this planning to what's already happening here on the island? Are there things that we should be examining and saying that perhaps they don't fit? Or are there things that we should be shifting resources to? Are there things we should be taking resources away from? So I'd like to see a lot more anchoring of this in the real world. What are we actually going to have to do? Because it just seems to me like there's an awful lot being recommended, and I don't know that we can accomplish it all. I don't know how it fits with what we have available for resources. So are there further comments or questions from committee members or the public at this time? Matt?
Yeah, Marion, in your, this is, I'm trying to think how to describe it. We have limited staff, we have limited resources, staff and funding, but sometimes how bike paths happen, for example, is they're funded by the neighborhood. So Cisco got funded by the neighborhood, and it jumped the line. We didn't have to wait for state funding, and the project was completed. And I had a call yesterday from Pocomo, and they had the worst year ever on the Walwinnett and Pocomo roads for traffic, and it's not safe for their kids or grandkids anymore. They're willing to fund it. It's preliminary. I'm talking to staff about, how would we even fit it in and get it done? But I think that's how we have to be thinking about sort of the coastal resiliency things. I think the neighborhoods, the people who are gaining benefit will have to pay for part of it. I'm not sure the percentages. It depends on the areas and the ability to pay and the amount of benefit. I think that those are the types of, I'm living in the real world, between my business and the town. And, so to get these things done takes money and staff and human resources. And so we are going to have to, and, I think if we want to get a lot of things done in the next 15 or 20 years, there are going to have to be betterments of some type. They're going to have to be, coastal, I can't remember the fancy name for them, but districts, sort of, districts and the people there, they're going to be betterment districts, but they're going to have be formed for this purpose and allocate the funds fairly. And I think, in how we structure the project oversight, how we structure those issues should probably be wrapped up into that entire that project or that package if we want to move forward. I look at, and I know there's a, I know it's politically SBPF, that whole thing is politically charged, but I think we are learning stuff from that process that, whether it stays forever or goes away tomorrow, we're learning stuff from that process that we need to carry forward for the rest of the island. So it's, so hopefully, hopefully we can, so anyway, those, we talk about real world, it's a step past what this, getting it done is going to be very difficult. So it's a step past where we are now, but some of it is actually underway and we're working on it.
Thank you, Matt. Helmut Weimar? You need to unmute. Helmut, we can't hear you. Can you unmute and start over?
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. The text in the report on the Sconset area referring to priority action areas of extreme coastal risk, which presumably includes the Baxter Road area, which has been eroding actively and a number of homes have been lost and so on. Summarizes at the end of the brief statement said, due to the extreme coastal risk, large structural investments are not recommended in these areas due to prohibitive maintenance costs and limited potential benefits. Meanwhile, we've got the geotubes, which have been in place for 8 years and have totally stopped erosion without harming neighboring beaches. And in your Baxter Road study, Arcadis Baxter Road study, it notes that the most effective way of dealing with erosion on the Baxter Road area is in fact geotubes. And then goes on to talk about a lot of other things, presumably because of permitting issues. It seems to me that this main Sconset section of the report should be consistent with the Baxter Road study that you, Arcadis, are doing in observing that the most effective way of protecting the Sconset Bluff and Baxter Road now, but the rest of the bluff later, if you will, if you take the 2100 point of view, would be geotubes. So that's my comment. I just think the two need to be consistent and need to include that observation.
Thank you. Trevor, any comment on that?
No additional comment. Agree. Agree with that.
Thank you. Other comments or questions from committee members or members of the public? I'm not seeing any, but we will wait a minute before we move on to the next item on the agenda. Actually, let me bring back the discussion to the question that was raised about the timeline. So, Trevor, if we were to extend the comment period, two questions. One is, would that cause difficulty for the project team in the work that they're doing? And the other is, would that be a benefit to the project team to have more time to continue to incorporate feedback on the plan and to continue to work on the remaining elements that were not included in the draft? So I'd like your input on that. And then also, what is the timeline if we don't make any changes, if we close comments yesterday and with this meeting, what would happen next?
Yes, so under the current, what we're currently planning for and have discussed with the town is, as you say, the comment period closed yesterday. I would say that that's a soft close. As with anything, the email address is still available, and we're happy to take additional comments. But what we're currently planning for is a deadline of excuse me, October 15th for submission of the final draft of the plan. So the idea of having the sort of deadline of yesterday or today for commentary and discussion would be to allow the project team time to review the comments that have come in and incorporate those into the final document. I think as to the question about the implications of extending the review period, I think it largely is a question of how long we're talking about. Are we talking about a week additional time, or are we talking about a month of additional time? There are implications for our team's ability to deliver the work on budget. So I think that's just something that we need to think about with, and I'll discuss with Vince separately as well as part of our weekly conversations. But I think for the committee, for discussion for the committee, it'd be helpful for us to have a kind of a sense of how much additional time we might be looking at in terms of providing as much comment as possible. And I would say the goal here is to make sure that there is sufficient time for the community to provide input on the plan. So we do not want to limit commentary in a way that is restrictive to having a better plan, or a plan that is inclusive of everyone's viewpoints. So I don't want anything I say to be interpreted to be kind of cutting off debate, as it were, calling the question in town meeting dialogue.
So if we can take a quick poll among committee members to start, are there committee members who, for instance, if we extended by 1 week the deadline for comments, are there committee members who would have comments that they would want to make to the project team in that week? And just give me a quick visual hand raise if there are. So I'm seeing several. So that sounds like it might be the approach we want to take, Trevor, would be to set a deadline, let's say Monday morning of next week. Comments should be into your project team by then, and that is a hard close. That would also apply to members of the public who wish to make comments. But since I'm seeing several committee members who are saying that they would take advantage of that, I'd like to request that. Vince, you have a comment on that?
Yeah, sorry, just looking at the calendar. Would it be acceptable to committee members if I put a hard time on it? Say 12 noon on that Monday, the 11th?
Actually, the 11th is a holiday, so we can
correct.
extend to midnight that day.
Works, that's fine.
Yeah.
Does that work for you, Trevor?
Midnight on October 11th?
Yes.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so
it doesn't really the time of day doesn't make too much of a difference.
So will that affect delivery day?
Yes, so that's what I was going to say. We will, we're reviewing the comments on a rolling basis and making changes. I do want to set the expectation that I think that we'll need 2 weeks from the close of the comment. We don't know what's going to come in at 12 midnight on the 9th. So it may warrant further 11th, excuse me, warrant more discussion with Vince and others. So, I think we do need a full 2 weeks as a project team to be able to incorporate those comments.
And I think that's certainly reasonable. So you had anticipated delivering on the 15th. This would push it back perhaps to the 25th, which is a Monday, 2 weeks from the 11th. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, I think our intention would be to try to have it on the 22nd, but we're happy to have the extra the 25th as a couple extra days, but we can try to have it by the 22nd.
It's actually the 22nd, because the Coastal Resilience Advisory is scheduled to meet on the 26th. It would be lovely to have it on the 22nd rather than the night before.
Okay.
So if that works for you, Trevor, if we can, Vince, I don't know if we need to do any paperwork on that, but do we need to take a vote at this committee? I don't think the committee has jurisdiction on that.
Once it's agreeable to the consultants, won't majorly affect the budget, and it seems agreeable to Trevor. I don't think there's a vote needed.
Okay.
Would that be fair? I'll take advice from anyone. Ian, Matt, Gary?
Yeah, I have a comment. So what happens on the 26th? Or whenever they have Arcadis has the 2 weeks. At the end of 2 weeks, they send us, is that their final, is the final document done, or are they sending us a redlined document that shows the final document, the draft document with the red lines showing the changes that have been made during this interim period? Which is it? And then after that, do we do anything about that? Or is that once we see the red line copy, it is no longer susceptible to change? That's the final document. What's the story? What's our thinking on that?
I think that's the exact next question, Gary, is what happens when the final report is delivered? I personally would rather not see a red line document. I'd rather see a polished document to be reviewed in whole. We are aware that in the draft, there are sections that are not included. So I just think redlining would not be helpful. It could distract from changes by the addition of new material. But that's my personal response. Before we go on to what happens next, was there any other comment on changing the deadline? I just want to make sure we don't lose any voices on that.
Well,
Ian?
thank you, Madam Chair. Only that I hope any comments we make register with Arcadis. Helmut brought up the Baxter Road memo, and I pointed out on September 16th that there was a factual inaccuracy on page 4 when it claimed that there were 3 houses protected by the geotubes. It is in fact 2, and the structure on 99 Baxter Road is a non-habitable shed that was moved on there, and that was not corrected. And I know Arcadis was very busy, but I was a bit disappointed that that wasn't included. I provided all the relevant documents for it. And well, so that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Ian. Peter, I know you also have your hand up. Was there something you wanted to add at this point in the discussion, or do you want me to come back to you?
No, it had to do with Helmut's comments, and right after Helmut's comments, Deanne Atherton, I don't know if she was trying to raise the hand to say something. She put a thumbs up instead, but it's worth asking her if she had something to say about that.
Okay, so we'll come back to that topic. I want to finish the discussion about the timeline before we do that. We're not leaving this agenda item. I just want to keep the topics together if we can. So our plan is to extend the comment period through midnight on Monday, the 11th. The Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is meeting on the 12th, but it will be a regular business meeting. It is not specific to the Coastal Resilience Plan. Then Trevor is saying that by the 22nd, they will deliver the update to the draft plan. And Trevor, can you comment on what that will look like? Yeah, as to Gary's point, is it going to be redlined? Is it going to be closed?
Our intention is,
yeah,
our intention is to provide the polished final document that is the CRP. So it will build off of, it will be a revision to what has already been delivered based on the feedback that we've gotten during this conversation and otherwise. And Ian, to your point, our goal is to correct any factual inaccuracies that have been identified. We'd certainly be addressing those and speaking to many of the other comments that we've had here. So there will be new information and revised information throughout the document.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. So then the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee would be meeting on the 26th, and presumably, the agenda is not set yet, but presumably that would be to review the final document. Then Vince, perhaps you can talk to what are the next steps in the process after the document is delivered?
Yeah, pretty, I'll deliver it in a linear way, not that it's pretty straightforward, but the kind of hope. This committee will eventually, after whatever final review, make a vote to approve, have other amendments, or to whatever else might be needed. And then once you approve it, I would recommend sending it to the select board for final approval.
Okay, and then Trevor, I do have a question. There are two sections of the draft that are placeholders for letters from town administration and from the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. At what point do you need that information so that it can be included in the plan? And it's sort of hard to write them when we haven't seen the plan yet. So that's kind of chicken and egg on that one.
Yeah, I think so we can always add I think we can add those in once, if it's desirable to the committee, we can add those letters in, continue to hold them as placeholders and just add those letters in at a later date after the final delivery. I don't have there's no problem with doing that. If you wanted to see them as part of the next submission, we would need those by the, let's say the 20th of October.
Yeah, I think if we can take advantage of your generosity and say we can add them later, that would be appropriate.
Yes, yeah, as long as we can have those delivered as kind of Word documents that can just be placed within the plan, then that's fine.
Thank you. Any other questions from committee members about the process as we move forward? Joanna?
I'm just wondering about this idea of some sort of 3-page summary and 5 bullet point list about the, I know Gary brought it up. So I'm wondering if this is going to be part of the plan or if this is going to be additional to the plan. Like this concept of having a 3-page digestible format so that in addition to the plan, there's like an introductory document that most people can read and understand quickly. And then also pulling out like the top 5 priorities. So just kind of like a high level view of the plan. I understand that the plan's going to be much longer and we have this time to still make comments, but those 2 particular things I think are important.
Thank you, Joanna. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to wait until we had the final delivery, so that in case we felt there was something that needed to be said in the message from the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee, that we would still have the opportunity to say it at that point. Sarah, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I actually kind of feel strongly in not having a 5-point priority list. I think it's really important to have priorities. I think the in the plan itself, it nuances the priorities, but we have small things, we have big things, we have research that needs to be done, committees that need to be formed, major funding projects, small funding projects. And so I think the types of priorities are going to be really different. There's the things that we can act on immediately. There's the things that are going to be like major expenses that are going to need to like spend a lot of time on. And then there's a lot of research that needs to be done, whether it's hydrology stuff or some of the ecological restorations or like just understanding more about a particular system. So I am hesitant to like have Arcadis put those like a top 5 because I would worry that that would be what everyone focuses on. And I think that I think the priority list I'm pointing here like you can see my other screen. I think the priority list as it is spelled out in the plan does a good job. We might, if we have recommendations for different priorities, I think that's a different discussion, but I'm just putting my 2 cents in that I'm hesitant for a top 5.
Thank you, Sarah. Trevor, do you have a response for that?
I was just gonna, I think I would agree with Sarah's point from the CRP team's perspective. Just, we've prioritized the 40 projects, and I think that is a solid foundation for the next steps that can be conducted through the crack in consultation with the town staff, right? In terms of discussing those top 5 priority projects. I think we could put forth priorities, but I think that it really does depend on a lot of additional work and engagement that needs to continue to happen in order to determine what those top 5 priorities are. What I would say, I think to Joanne, your point, we did discuss last week the idea of kind of what are the immediate next steps if you're, from different vantage points, if you're a committee member on crack or another committee, if you're a member of the public, if you're, the natural resources department. So we were hoping to put together kind of, in terms of the next steps, a little bit more guidance of what those might be, but that's a little bit different from like a project prioritization.
Vince?
I just did a quick flick through this just to kind of understand the prioritization in some way. There's 19 things that are down as priority 1. And then from that list of 19, so to speak, once we start getting into grant cycling, a lot of grants have very targeted purposes. So we might find a grant that might suit one of the priorities of the priority 1s pretty quickly. Others we might have to wait. Others the crack might want to prioritize above others. And then kind of getting back to something Matt Fee said earlier, and something that I'm kind of always looking for, is there might be a project that some local homeowner group or some individual may wish to pay for that might be priority 1 that might get bumped up the list. And that's another thing we cross off earlier because somebody decided to assist us. That's something I always take, I don't mind saying, provided it fits in the town's legal framework.
Thank you, Vince. Other comments or questions, Fritz? Fritz, you're on mute.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page about what's going to happen on the 26th. I would assume, since the comment period will be closed, that the 26th is really the opportunity for us to take a look at the final draft and not an opportunity for additional comment, to raise additional comments. I would understand if for some reason in that final report, someone felt that something specifically was supposed to be added or done and wasn't, that would be a fair comment. But that the 26th is not an opportunity for the members or the public to just start raising additional issues.
I would agree with that, Fritz. I'd also add it's not an opportunity for members of the committee to raise additional issues. It won't be a draft report at that point. It will be a final report. There may be, an error correction that happens, but I don't think that, and Trevor, please, correct me if I'm misstating anything. I don't think that there will be any change in the content or scope at that point.
And for the purposes of the agenda, would we be voting on it that night, or would that be at?
I think we would be discussing it, and it depends on the direction of the discussion, whether or not somebody calls for a motion at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Trevor, was there anything you wanted to add in response to Fritz's comments?
No, I appreciate Fritz, you're clarifying that. I think that's right. Errors are always, any error that is in the plan would, we will of course make changes, to the document to make sure that is addressed. But in terms of the substance, recommendations, and scope of the document, yeah, that would not be that period will close next week.
All right, Matt, you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be careful. This isn't going to be perfect, and it's only going to be as good as the implementation by all of us moving forward. We have plenty of plans that had a lot of details, a lot of things that should have happened, of which only a few happened. And so, I hope that isn't the case with this, but I think we shouldn't get too tied up in knots with, some of it. The broad scopes, I think, are right, and I think the plan is really good. And I think we need to get into the next phase of this.
Thank you, Matt. Ian, and then we'll go to Deanne Atherton, who has her hand up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree completely with Matt, and I think Arcadis is doing a very good job that is not only essential for the island to discuss going forward, but if this doesn't get people off the starting blocks, I don't know what will. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Deanne, can you unmute?
Yes, Mary. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I have two comments. One refers back to the original kind of core values that Arcadis asked the community about, and that was inclusion and equity. And I get concerned when I hear talk about private funding from individuals who have the wealth to fund that, and how we as a community deal with it. So I hope that we will be mindful of that value, which I think makes us who we are. That's my first comment. My second comment, well, not directly in response to Mr. Weimar's comments a few minutes ago, but more in the terms of communications, I think it's really important for CRAC, and I'm so glad we have a CRAC, to, in its neutral role, to make sure that what's being recommended in these reports is what's being communicated. And an example was Mr. Weimar's comment, and he's absolutely correct. The Arcadis Baxter Road team did say that geotubes would be the most effective if there were not other two important criteria. And that was stakeholder input, and now I'm forgetting the second one. Oh, regulatory considerations. And they were, in fact, are not recommending extending the geotubes. So what's being communicated to the community is in contradiction to what's in the report. And it's not up, the Coastal Conservancy or the Land Council can't do that communication. We look to you in your role, in your neutral role, to please help us with that. We have already gotten feedback from Off Island, from professionals in the business who say there is some concern that the Baxter Road project is being misrepresented. And if that's so, I hope that CRAC can address it. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanne. Other comments or questions from committee members or members of the public at this point? So no other feedback on the Coastal Resilience Plan or on the timeline for the remainder of October. If there's no other discussion, we'll go to the next item on the agenda. We do have on the agenda public comment. So if there is something that the public wanted to say that is not specific to the Coastal Resilience Plan, we do have that opportunity here today as well. We'll wait a second to see if anybody has a question that they wanted to raise. And then the final item on our agenda would be for the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee to help begin to consider the letter that we would write for the Coastal Resilience Plan. We're not trying to write it today. So I'm not seeing any other comments or questions on the Coastal Resilience Plan, so we will move on to that letter. So the initial suggestion that we received was that that I would be asked to write the letter, and I would bring it to the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee for feedback and approval, and then that letter would go into the Coastal Resilience Plan. That's one path, but I would not want to write the letter from my perspective. If that was the way we chose to do it, I would want the committee members to suggest things that might be focused on in the letter. Are there statements that you want to make? Are there, areas that you want to cover? If I'm writing it, give me somewhere to start, or if there's an alternative plan for how to create this letter, open to suggestions on that. Gary?
So one question I have is, so the report is finalized and it's sent out. And as Matt was saying before, then we get on to the next step, okay? Question is, what is that next step? Is the report specific enough to recommend what the next few steps are? Or is it something we should put in our letter saying, now that this report is here, we recommend that these following, that this is the next step, or it's 2 steps or 3 steps that should be taken by the town, whether it's forming some separate work groups or committees or whatever. Question is, what happens after the report is finalized and published? And someone has to say, okay, now what do we do? And the question is, are we going to recommend that, or is the report going to recommend that? That's my question.
Vince, do you have a response for that?
Yeah, I hope I'm able to cover this properly. So this is where the term living document comes in. And this is the kind of where this CRP document doesn't get forgotten about. I was saying a few minutes ago, there's 19 projects that got priority 1, then there's a handful of others that got priority 2 and 3. So within the first couple of years, I would imagine it would be on track to help determine which of those, say, priority 19 priority 1 projects would get pushed forward first. And that would be one way to look at this. That's the living side of this document. There's another thing to consider as well, that one of the next phases for Arcadis post-delivery is to take one of those projects and start developing it into something that will be for a grant cycle. That's something else to bear in mind as well, so that it's going to pretty much quickly hit the ground running for implementation. It again, because it's a municipal project, everything will take time. But in terms of how the progress is going to work, from a municipal standpoint, it'll probably start going quite quickly. And hopefully the interest that we'll have generated will keep that moving. Does that help?
Thank you, Vince. So to respond to both Gary and Vince, that's one of the things I imagined might be in the letter, is sort of a message to the community saying, okay, we've got the plan. What happens next? How are we going to use it? That might be one area that we focus on in the letter. And we'll have to figure out what the answer to that is, but not this morning. Joanna?
I think this is partially what I was trying to get at with this priority idea, which is probably more like order of operations type thinking, which is what comes next and how can you break it down into some bites of what has to be done. Because when you look at a list of 19 priority 1 projects, and as Sarah points out, other research and other engagement of other groups and stakeholders, it's complicated. So if we can take the opportunity to direct the people who are digesting all this information to the places where this needs to go next, I think we would be well served.
Thank you, Joanna. Other comments or questions from committee members? All right, does anyone else have a suggestion for a topic or something that we might be using the letter to address the public? Sarah?
Yeah, I just think some of the work that you put into the annual report that we do for the town has a lot of that great information. So I think kind of borrowing from that, because like anything I was thinking of was, so sort of like starting with what we tried to do and how we, this is island wide, it's for everyone. And, it's unique because of encompassing the entirety of the island, not just town properties, and just all the things that are unique about the plan and where our goals were. But I think a lot of that was written in that report. So
thank you, Sarah. It's always good to have a cheat sheet.
Borrow and just wordsmith it a bit. Yeah.
Jen?
Thanks, Mary. Sarah already said a lot of things I was going to say that we can borrow from what we've already done in the island-wide piece. But I also think maybe a little bit of, if it makes sense, a looking forward and what we're hoping to accomplish as CRAC with this plan, and the, support for the town as they work through stuff, but also support, as I was kind of saying earlier, for homeowners associations and areas of the island, and a resource to help honestly advocate for the actions proposed in this plan, so we could move it forward, something along that line.
Thank you, Jen. Other comments or questions from committee members? Trevor, let me ask you, is there something that you typically see when you have a local body, provide an introduction to the plan?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think overall, everything that's been discussed here, I think, is great in terms of you want to kind of provide directionality to the constituents that you serve, right? The community that you serve, in terms of what this means and how it's going to serve the town moving forward. Often we do see sort of a discussion in this about how this plan fits within the larger trajectory of work that's happened before and that will happen in the future. So kind of creating that narrative of this is one piece of a much longer planning process that has involved work that's come before the CRP and will come afterwards, right? And then I think people want to see that there's been an intentional process and that the CRAC has been involved throughout this work, and that you are, sort of positioned as the local leaders of this effort. So kind of just championing it as the statement of the CRAC and the community in terms of what we know about coastal resilience at this time. Those are the three kind of major themes that we generally see, but every community is different, and I would certainly encourage the CRAC to make it your own, and develop an introduction that you think is suitable for this work.
Thank you, Trevor. So one question I have for the committee, the coastal resilience plan doesn't really address that climate change is the reason for all of this, and that there are things that we should be doing to address the problem of climate change, not just the problem of coastal resiliency. And is that a topic that you think we should cover in the introduction? Sarah?
Going back to the borrowing from things we've already done, I think that I think that's a great point, Mary. And I think that work we did for the select board, adopting the high scenario, what are we calling that? I forget the recommendation. I think borrowing some of the language from that is really great, but also to your point about just saying, about climate change, about like changes that we can make, and obviously that's something that we'll have to wordsmith and agree, and I'll agree on that language, but I think that's such a good point to take a step back.
Thank you, Sarah. Other comments or questions? Ian?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So are you suggesting possibly that we add sort of the nuts and bolts of reducing our carbon footprint, i.e. recommending having solar panels on all roofs outside of the core historic district, and those sort of suggestions, or more generalizations?
Just speaking from what I was thinking, but it is up to the committee to decide how far we would go or how much we would include. I would say that we would probably want to say something about, the coastal resilience plan is only one part of a larger effort to address the effects of climate change. And along with that, the town should be looking at alternative energy sources and reducing petroleum use and whatever level of detail we want to go into. But the point being that we're not just simply trying to implement coastal resilience so that we can keep on doing what we've been doing to create climate change. It's only one of many avenues that we need to take to protect the island, if that helps.
Well, if I may reply, I think that's a very good idea. I mean, I absolutely am on board for that.
Thank you, Ian. Other comments? All right, we have no other items on our agenda. I will remind the public that the recording for this meeting and the recording for last week's meeting will be available on the town's YouTube channel. If you missed one, you can review it there. We do have now an extended deadline for public comment through next Monday, the 11th. Please do feel free to send your comments to the project team. And again, that address is nantucket.crp@arcadis.com. You can always email Vince if you're not able to get through to Arcadis. He can forward it on. You're always welcome at our Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee meetings, and thank you for attending today. Any final comments from the public before we adjourn? And I'm not seeing any immediately, so it will entertain a motion to adjourn unless the committee members have any further comments.
So moved.
Second.
Second by Jen. So roll call vote. All those in favor, Gary Beller,
Aye.
Sarah Boyce,
Hi.
Peter Brace,
Aye.
Matt Fee,
Aye.
Ian Golding,
Aye.
Jen Carberg,
Aye.
Fritz McClure. I think that was an aye, Fritz. Joanna Roach
Aye.
and Mary Longacre, aye. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Mary. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.